They called him coward before they called him captain. Before the mud took his boots, before the dead learned his name, before 58 condemned souls marched beneath a rotten penal banner into the Graven Mire, Oskar Venn was already a man the Empire had buried without the courtesy of a grave. He had lost a fortress. He had lost 300 soldiers. He had ordered retreat while the walls still stood and the guns still smoked, and for that the courts had stripped him of rank, honor, and future. They said he had run from battle. They said fear had broken him. They were wrong. Fear would have been kinder. What Oskar Venn had seen at Kappelbruch was not an army of corpses clawing mindlessly at stone. It was something worse, something patient, something that listened while men died, something that learned passwords from severed tongues, drill commands from murdered sergeants, courage from the brave, cruelty from the cruel, and strategy from every officer it dragged screaming into the dark. The dead remembered, and in the swamps beyond Fort Muckenhoff, they were remembering war. So when the Empire needed someone desperate enough to march into that rotting green hell, they did not send heroes. Heroes were expensive. Heroes had families, patrons, songs waiting to be written. Instead, they sent convicts, drunkards, deserters, poachers, murderers, men and women already sentenced by law, by debt, by shame, or by the simple misfortune of surviving when better people had not. And at their head, they placed the disgraced officer who had once tried to warn them. Captain Oskar Venn was given a sword notched with rust, a company no one wanted, and orders no sane commander would obey. Enter the Graven Mire. Find the source of the dead. Destroy it. Return, if Sigmar wills it. But Sigmar was far from that swamp. In the mire, there were only black reeds, drowned bones, and drums beating beneath the mud. And the dead were waiting to learn them all. Chapter 1. The penal banner rain came down like nails over Fort Muckenhoff, hammering the yard into a brown soup of mud, horse dung, and old blood. Captain Oskar Venn was dragged through it in irons. He had not been called captain in 18 months. In the prison ledgers he was Oskar Venn, condemned officer, dereliction, cowardice, and unlawful retreat before the enemy. In the mouths of the gaolers he was simply the runner. Among the soldiers watching from beneath their sodden caps, he was worse than that. He was a warning. A man who had worn a feathered hat, carried a polished blade, shouted orders in the name of the Empire, and still ended with wrists rubbed raw by chains. The guards shoved him hard enough that he stumbled knee-deep into the muck. Laughter rattled from the covered walkways. Somewhere, a man coughed himself bloody. Somewhere else, behind a stockade wall, a condemned prisoner was singing a drinking song badly and receiving a beating for every missed note. Venn lifted his head. Fort Muckenhoff crouched at the edge of the Graven Mire like a sick dog unwilling to die. Its walls were timber and stone patched with tar, its watchtowers leaned, and its chapel bell had a crack through it wide enough for rainwater to pour in. Beyond the western palisade stretched the swamp. Black reeds, drowned trees, pale vapor, and pools that reflected the sky like dead eyes. The place stank of rot, even through the rain. A line of soldiers stood across the yard, halberdiers in provincial colors, handgunners with match cords kept beneath their cloaks. A few hard-faced knights watched from horseback near the gate, their armor streaked with mud. These were not men gathered for ceremony. They were gathered to make sure no one ran. At the far end of the yard, Beneath a canvas awning stood Marshal Adjutant Kessel, a narrow man in a black cuirass, polished so well the rain seemed ashamed to touch it. Beside him waited a priest of Sigmar, with a hammer at his belt and a face like a locked door. Kessel looked Venn over as if inspecting spoiled meat. "Remove his irons," he said. One guard hesitated. "Pode." "Sir?" I said. "Remove them. If he runs, shoot his legs. I want him able to stand." The shackles were unlocked. Venn's hands fell free, numb and trembling. The skin beneath the manacles was purple and split. He flexed his fingers and felt every old break complain. Kessel stepped closer. He smelled faintly of cloves and cold steel. Oskar Venn, former captain of the 3rd Nordgott Foot, survivor of the Kappelbruch disaster. The yard quieted at that name. Even the rain seemed to strike softer. Venn said nothing. 312 men under your command, Kessel continued. 49 returned. You ordered withdrawal without sanction, abandoned the redoubt, and allowed the enemy to occupy Imperial ground. Venn's voice scraped out like a boot across gravel. The enemy was already inside the redoubt. Kessel smiled thinly. Yes, your statement, repeated at trial, repeated under oath, repeated under pain. The dead were learning our signals, our passwords, our gun drill, our formations. A fascinating fantasy. It was not fantasy. The priest's eyes narrowed. Kessel turned slightly, allowing the watching soldiers to hear. You were sentenced to hang at Geheimnisnacht. Unfortunately for justice, the enemy has become inconvenient. He gestured toward the swamp. 3 wagons waited there, lined against the palisade. Not supply wagons, prison wagons, cages on wheels. Inside them crouched the refuse of 3 provinces, convicts, deserters, debtors, men with brands on their cheeks, women with prison-cropped hair, one huge fellow with a butcher's build and a grin full of broken teeth, a pair of smugglers with eel tattoos winding up their necks, a one-eyed youth shaking so badly he looked already dead. Several were drunk, several were wounded. One had vomited down the front of his tunic and was laughing at it. "The Mire Company," Kessel said. "Your new command." This time, laughter came from the cages. "Command?" someone shouted. "Give him a mop," another voice slurred. "Captain Mudboots." A tin cup clanged against the bars. Venn looked at them and understood the shape of the joke. The Empire had decided to execute him with paperwork rather than rope. Kessel handed him a folded parchment sealed with black wax. By authority of the Provincial War Council, you are hereby restored to temporary field rank. You will take these men and women into the Graven Mire. You will locate the source of the undead incursions. You will destroy it. Should you succeed, the matter of your sentence may be reconsidered. And if I refuse? Kessel's smile widened by a hair. The priest spoke for the first time. Then Sigmar receives your confession now, and the crows receive the rest. A thunderclap rolled across the sky. Behind it, from somewhere deep in the mire, came a sound like a drum beaten beneath the earth. Once, twice. Every man in the yard heard it. No one laughed after that. Venn opened the parchment. The ink had begun to bleed in the rain, but the order was clear enough. March before dusk. No retreat permitted. State troops to hold the road behind. Penal command considered expendable. Ammunition rationed. Flame stores restricted. Casualty recovery discouraged. Casualty recovery discouraged. That made his stomach tighten more than the threat of hanging. Kessel noticed. "You know something of these creatures," he said softly. "That is why you are useful." Venn looked at the swamp. The mist shifted between the trees. For a moment he thought he saw men standing out there in the reeds, but when he blinked, there were only black trunks and hanging moss. "You are not sending enough," Venn said. "We are sending what we can afford to lose." "No," Venn said. "You are sending what you believe the dead cannot use." Kessel said nothing. The priest made the sign of the hammer. "Then see that they die cleanly." Venn turned toward the prison wagons. "Open them!" The guards did so with reluctance and loaded pistols. The prisoners spilled into the yard like offal from a split sack. The big butcher-looking man shoved another convict aside and stretched his arms. His hands were scarred across the knuckles. "Who do I kill to get breakfast?" "No one," Venn said. "You kill who I tell you when I tell you." The man grinned. "And who are you meant to be?" "Your captain. My last captain got his head pulled through his arse by a troll. Then he set a low standard. That earned a few ugly chuckles." A woman near the second wagon watched Venn with sharp, fox-like eyes. She had a poacher's cloak, patched leather, and a length of cord wrapped around one wrist. Her prison brand was fresh. She looked at the walls, the guards, the road, the swamp, and then at Venn, measuring distances, counting risks. "You," Venn said. "Name, Martha Clegg. Crime, killed a gamekeeper. Why? He tried to hang my brother for snaring rabbits. Can you shoot? Better than your handgunners." One of the soldiers spat. "Martha did not look at him." Venn pointed to the far wagon, where a gaunt man with yellowing eyes clutched the bars though the door was open. "You! Out!" The man swallowed. "No." The yard went still. Venn walked to him. The man's uniform still showed beneath his prison rags, old state colors, torn away at the collar. A deserter. "Name, Ruprecht Fein." "Out." Fein's lips trembled. "You don't want to go in there." "No, I don't." "They remember," Fein whispered. "They remember your voice after they cut it out of you. They remember where you hide your knife. They remember your mother's name if you scream it when you die." Venn held his stare. "Then scream nothing useful." Fein gave a broken laugh that turned into a sob. Venn grabbed him by the front of his rags and hauled him into the mud. The company formed badly. Very badly. They slouched, spat, cursed, scratched, and stole from each other in the space of 10 breaths. One man tried to slip toward the latrines and was brought down by a musket butt that cracked his cheekbone with a wet pop. Another bit a guard's hand to the bone and received a sword pommel in the mouth for his trouble. Teeth scattered into the mud like dice. Venn watched it all without flinching. A penal sergeant named Halbrecht issued their gear from a covered cart. Rust-specked swords, patched shields, damp powder horns, short spears, axes, billhooks, knives, 3 battered handguns, 2 crossbows, and a single light swivel cannon mounted on a mule cart. The cannon's wheels were warped. The mule looked suicidal. A red-nosed artilleryman in a torn engineer's coat lurched toward it, clutching a bottle. "Oh, my darling," he said, laying both hands on the cannon. "What brute has let you rust? Sergeant Halbrecht clubbed him in the belly. "Hands off!" The man folded, wheezed, then vomited between his boots. After a moment, he looked up at Venn and raised one finger. "Holtzbrenner," he said. "Master gunner. Formally, temporarily, depending on who's asking. You drunk? Professionally. Can you fire that thing?" Holtz blinked at the cannon with wounded dignity. "I could make love to a countess with that thing at 400 paces. Good. Sober up." "Impossible order. I'll interpret generously." The priest approached then, boots sinking into the yard. His robe was patched beneath a breastplate, and his beard had been hacked short as if by a knife rather than scissors. He wore a hammer pendant, but it was tarnished, almost black. "Brother Jorvan," Kessel said from behind Venn, "attach spiritual authority." Jorvan glared at the convicts. "This rebel has souls?" "Most of us sold ours," Holtz muttered. Jorvan heard and stepped close enough that his breath steamed against Holtz's face. "Then I will teach you to regret the price." Venn looked from the priest to Kessel. "Why is he disgraced?" Jorvan answered himself. "I struck a nobleman who mocked a burial prayer. With your fist? With a shovel?" Holtz brightened. "I like him." By late afternoon, the rain had thinned to a greasy mist. The Mire Company stood assembled beneath its banner, a rotten strip of yellow cloth marked with a black numeral and an old imperial skull. It hung limp from a spear haft. No blessings were given. No drums played them out. No citizens cheered from the walls. The western gate opened. The swamp breathed at them. Venn marched first, because he knew if he did not, none of them would move. Mud swallowed his boots beyond the gate. Cold water seeped through the cracked leather. Behind him came Marta, with a crossbow over one shoulder, Holtz beside the mule cart whispering encouragement to the cannon, Brother Jorvan muttering prayers, Ruprecht Fane shivering as though fevered, and the rest of the condemned dragging themselves forward in a loose, miserable column. Behind them, state troops rolled a barricade across the road. One of the convicts turned and saw it. "Oi!" he shouted. "They're penning us in!" A handgunner raised his weapon. Venn did not turn. "Keep walking." The swamp closed quickly. Within 100 paces, Fort Muckenhoff was a smudge behind curtains of mist and hanging moss. The path became a ribbon of black mud. Flies gathered in clouds. Leeches clung to ankles. Reeds whispered against armor. Twice men stepped off the track and sank to the thigh, cursing while others hauled them free. Once they passed a horse skeleton standing upright in a pool, its bones knitted together by reeds. As dusk thickened, the drums began again. Slow, distant, under the mud. Ruprecht Fane started muttering. Too soon, they know. Marta walked beside Venn. He's going to bolt. Yes. You going to stop him? No. She glanced at him. Venn kept his eyes on the mist. Let the company see what happens. Fane. Lasted another 12 minutes. A shape moved between the trees to the left. It might have been a man. It might have been a branch. Fane made a small, strangled noise, dropped his spear, and ran. He splashed off the path into knee-deep water, clawing through reeds, sobbing, "No, no, no, no!" The company halted. No one called after him. Fane made it perhaps 20 yards before the pool erupted. Hands burst from the black water. Not 2, not 4, a dozen. Grey fingers clamped around his legs, his belt, his hair. Fane screamed as he went down, came up, went down again. Something pale rose beneath him. A drowned soldier in a rusted helmet, jaw hanging loose, one eye socket packed with mud. Another surfaced beside it, then another. Fane stabbed wildly with a knife. The blade punched into a dead face and came out through the cheek with a sound like wet leather tearing. The corpse did not care. It caught his wrist and bent it backward until the bone snapped loud enough for the whole company to hear. Fane screamed words then. Names, please. A prayer to Sigma. A prayer to his mother. A prayer to anyone listening. The dead listened. One corpse leaned close, as if savoring him. Its split mouth opened. Ruprecht, it croaked in a voice full of swamp water. Fane stopped screaming. The dead dragged him under. Bubbles thrashed on the surface. Red spread through the black pool in smoky ribbons. Something beneath the water jerked and tore. A pale chunk of flesh floated up. Then a strip of cloth. Then Fane's hand, missing 2 fingers, surfaced palm up as if asking a final question. The company stood frozen. The water became still. Holtz made the sign of the hammer with his bottle. Marta's face had gone hard. You knew. I suspected, Venn said. That thing said his name. Yes, a convict. Behind them retched. Another began laughing too loudly. Then the reeds ahead parted. Soldiers emerged from the mist. Dead soldiers. They came in rotten ranks, not shambling but marching. Boots sucked through mud in time. Rusted breastplates hung from collapsed chests. Spear points glimmered black. Their uniforms were scraps from a dozen regiments, some old enough to be antiques, some fresh enough that blood still darkened the cloth. Their faces were swollen, split, or gnawed clean to bone. One had a fish wriggling inside its open throat. Another wore its own scalp like a wet cap over one ear. At their front walked Fane, or what had been Fane. His neck hung wrong. His broken wrist flopped at his side. Mud poured from his mouth. His eyes were open and full of panic, but they no longer belonged to him. He raised his good hand and pointed directly at Venn. They fire high when afraid. Fane's corpse gurgled. The drunk one tends powder. The woman watches left. The captain waits before giving orders. The dead soldiers adjusted their line. The Mire company recoiled. Venn felt the old coldness enter him. Not fear, exactly. Fear had heat. This was memory. Kappelbruch, the redoubt, men dying twice, sergeants returning with stolen commands in their throats, the dead learning the living one butchered lesson at a time. He drew his sword. It was a cheap prison-issue blade. Naked, unbalanced, ugly. Good enough. Front rank kneel, he said. No one moved. The dead advanced. Venn turned and punched the nearest convict in the jaw hard enough to drop him into the mud. Kneel, you miserable bastards, or die standing where they can see your bellies. That worked. The front rank fell clumsily. Spears lowered. Axes shook. Marta slipped left without being told. Crossbow raised. Holtz scrambled to the cannon cart, suddenly less drunk than he seemed. Fane's corpse opened its mouth again. He will order volley at 20 paces. Venn smiled, without humor. Volley now. The handguns fired raggedly. Smoke burst white in the wet air. One shot took a dead spearman through the throat, blowing out the spine in a spray of black fluid. Another shattered a skull so rotten the top half peeled away and slapped into the reeds. Crossbow bolts thunked into torsos. The dead kept coming. Too far, Fane's corpse said. Shut him up, Venn snapped. Marta fired. Her bolt struck Fane in the mouth and punched out through the back of his skull. His head snapped backward. For one blessed second, he was silent. Then he reached up, gripped the bolt, and slowly pulled it free with a wet scrape of bone. Left, he croaked. The dead surged. They hit the company like a wall of butcher's scraps. A convict swung an axe into a corpse's shoulder and split it down to the ribs. The corpse drove a spear through his stomach in return. The point burst from his back, trailing loops of gut. He looked down, astonished, and tried to hold himself together. A second dead soldier hooked fingers into his mouth and tore his cheek open to the ear before biting into his throat. Brother Jorvan roared a hymn and smashed his hammer into a skull. Bone exploded. Teeth flew. He kicked the body back into another and kept swinging, every blow accompanied by a word of prayer or profanity until the two became indistinguishable. Holtz fired the swivel cannon. The sound cracked the swamp open. Scrap iron, nails, and broken chain blasted through the undead line. 3 corpses vanished from the waist up. A 4th spun apart, arms flying loose, its helmet ringing against a tree. The recoil punched the mule cart backward into the mud and knocked Holtz flat. He lay there laughing. "Countess!" he shouted. 400 paces! Then moved where the line buckled. He cut hands, not heads. Hands held weapons. Hands grabbed throats. Hands dragged men down. His blade chopped through dead wrists and fingers, sending black blood flicking across his coat. A corpse lunged at him with a bayonet. He stepped inside, slammed his shoulder into its chest, felt ribs collapse like damp sticks, then hacked through its neck until the head came free by a tendon. Something seized his boot. A drowned thing, only half emerged from the mud, clawed up his leg. Its fingernails scraped leather. Its mouth opened impossibly wide. Venn stamped down until its jaw broke. Then again until the skull caved in and mud filled the hole. "Forward!" he shouted. The company stared at him as if he had gone mad. "Forward, damn you! Push them into the water!" Marta understood first. She shot a corpse through the knee, then kicked it sideways into the pool. Others followed. The convicts screamed, cursed, and shoved. Spears became poles, shields became rams. Men who had never stood in formation in their lives hurled themselves together out of pure terror, and terror did what discipline could not. The undead line slipped. One corpse went backward into the pool, then another. The mud sucked at their boots. The living pushed harder. Brother Jorvan drove his hammer into a dead officer's breastplate and sent it toppling. Holtz, bleeding from the nose, rammed powder into the cannon with manic tenderness. "Down!" he screamed. Venn threw himself flat. The second blast tore through the reeds at waist height. Dead men came apart in chunks. An arm landed beside Venn, fingers still twitching. A jawbone spun through the air and struck a convict in the forehead, knocking him senseless. The pool became a thrashing mess of limbs, smoke, and black blood. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the attack broke. The remaining dead withdrew into the mist, dragging their damaged bodies with horrible patience. Fane's corpse was among them, jaw hanging by strips. Marta's bolt still clutched in one hand. It turned, before vanishing. In a bubbling, ruined voice, it said, "Captain Oskar Venn." The name passed through the swamp. Other voices took it up. "Oskar Venn, Oskar Venn, Oskar Venn." Then the mist swallowed them. No one moved for a long while. Rain hissed into powder smoke. The wounded groaned. A man with his belly opened tried to stuff his entrails back in, weeping because they kept slipping through his fingers. Brother Jorvan knelt beside him, pressed the hammer pendant to his brow, and whispered a prayer. When the man began to scream again, Jorvan took a knife and ended it quickly. Marta looked at Venn. Her face was speckled with black blood. They know your name now. Venn wiped his sword on the coat of a corpse that would not stay dead for long. Yes, he said. Holtz peered into the mist and raised his bottle in salute. Popular fellow. The company stared at their captain differently after that. Not with trust. Not yet, but with the hard attention men give a bridge over a ravine. Rotten, perhaps, dangerous, certainly, but currently the only thing between them and the drop. Venn looked back the way they had come. The road was gone. Fort Muckenhof was gone. Only swamp remained, black and endless beneath the bruised evening sky. Ahead, deep in the Graven Mire, the drums began again. This time, they beat in marching time. Chapter 2. The Dead Who Learn. By midnight, the Mire Company had learned the first law of the Graven Mire. Nothing that sank was finished. The dead from the skirmish were shoved into the black water with spear hafts and boot heels, but the swamp received them without gratitude. Bodies slipped beneath the surface slowly, as though being swallowed by a throat. Helms vanished, fingers vanished, faces vanished last, white and pulped and staring up through the murk. One convict, a lean cut-purse named Vert, stood too near the edge while prodding a corpse with his billhook. The water bulged. A hand shot out and clamped around his ankle. He screamed, hacked downward, and split the wrist to the bone, but the dead hand only tightened. Another hand surfaced, then teeth. A mouth rose through the mud and bit into the meat of his calf. Wirt howled. The sound went high and girlish as the corpse tore loose a strip of flesh. Blood ran into the pool in hot ribbons. Marta put a crossbow bolt through the thing's eye socket. Brother Jorvan stamped on its wrist until the fingers opened. Wirt fell backward, sobbing, clutching his leg while blood pumped between his fingers. "Burn them," Venn said. Nobody argued. They made a pyre from damp roots, broken shields, and the least rotten pieces of old driftwood. Holtzbrenner poured cheap spirits over the pile with the mournful care of a priest anointing a saint. "Waste of good medicine," he muttered. "Pour," Venn said. Holtz poured. The bodies were heaved onto the pyre. Some were imperial corpses. Some had once been brigands or soldiers from border wars older than the men staring at them. Some were too ruined to tell. One had no head, but its hands continued to open and close in slow, hungry movements. Another had been blasted apart by Holtz's cannon and still dragged itself in halves through the mud, spilling black jelly and ropey organs behind it, until Marta pinned its spine with a spear. When the fire finally took, it burned green. The stink was unbearable. Wet hair, old meat, grave wax, boiled leather. Men gagged and spat. One of the deserters fell to his knees and retched until only bile came up. The flames licked through ribs and empty eye sockets. Fat popped in the heat. Fingers curled into fists. Teeth cracked like musket shot. Venn stood close enough that sparks bit his coat. He watched every body burn. Behind him, the company whispered. They whispered about Ruprecht Fane, whose corpse had spoken Venn's name. They whispered about the dead marching in formation. They whispered about the road gone behind them, and the barricade that would be waiting if they tried to return. Most of all, they whispered about the way the undead had listened. The dead did not simply kill, they collected. Venn could feel the thoughts spreading through the company like rot beneath skin. Every man and woman there had secrets, crimes, names, shame, cowardice, treachery. Some had killed for coin, some had run from battle, some had watched friends die and done nothing. It was one thing to fear death, it was another to fear death with an audience. Near the cannon cart, Holtz sat in the mud and polished the barrel with his sleeve. "You saw that, Captain?" he said, without looking up. "I saw many things. They waited until I packed scrap into the mouth. Next time, they'll rush before I prime, or they'll shoot me, or they'll take the wheels. Yes, comforting. You wanted a lie. I wanted breakfast." Venn crouched beside him. The cannon was small, ugly, and badly maintained, but it had saved the company twice already. Its iron throat was black with powder. Its carriage groaned at every touch. "Can you make it fire faster?" Holtz laughed. "Can you make a priest sin slower?" Brother Jorvan, overhearing, turned his head. His hammer rested across his knees. Its head was dark, with fragments of skull. "I can hear you, drunkard. I counted on it." Venn ignored them both. "Can you?" Holtz's smile faded. He tapped the barrel. "Not safely." "Then do it unsafely." That pleased him. They marched before dawn. The swamp changed shape around them. Paths vanished. Pools opened where solid mud had been. Trees leaned closer, their branches crooked like fingers trying to pluck helmets from skulls. The mist never lifted. It moved with the company, sliding between boots, coiling around throats, dulling sound until men at the rear seemed to be marching in another world. Venn placed Marta and the eel rats ahead as scouts. The smugglers moved through the mire with unsettling ease, bare feet sinking where boots would drown, knives tucked behind their backs, eel tattoos shifting when their muscles flexed. Their leader, a narrow-faced woman named Sana Reedknife, claimed she could smell deep water before seeing it. She could also smell death. "Old battle here," she said, crouching near a patch of reeds. The company halted. Venn knelt. Beneath the mud lay bones, many bones, not fresh, not clean. Spears and pikes jutted up at angles, swallowed by moss. A shattered drum lay half submerged, its skin stretched tight by rot. Something metal glinted in the muck, a breastplate crushed inward as if the man inside had been embraced by a giant. "Battlefield?" Marta asked. "Ambush ground," Venn said. He pointed. There, beneath hanging moss, were the remains of old earthworks. A sunken firing step, a ditch full of brown water, a line of stakes just beneath the surface, sharpened long ago and waiting still. Holtz whistled. Somebody had a nasty day. Not as nasty as ours if we keep walking blind. Venn turned. "Work parties. Pull the stakes and reset them facing east. Trip lines between the roots. Powder charges under the dry hummocks, quietly." The company stared at him. A branded murderer named Golt scratched his beard. "We're digging in. We're preparing to be followed. By dead men." "Yes," Golt spat. "Dead men don't care about stakes." "No," Venn said. But they care about walking. Take their legs, and they become scenery. There was a rough murmur of approval at that. For the next 2 hours, the Mire Company turned the swamp against itself. They dragged old stakes from the water, wiped leeches from their arms, and hammered wood into mud with the butts of weapons. Marta strung wire and cord between roots at shin height. The eel rats found a narrow channel under a curtain of moss and marked it as a killing lane. Holtz packed powder into cracked clay jars, muttering to each as if naming children. Brother Jorven moved among them, offering prayers none had asked for. Sigmar watches the condemned as he watches kings, he said. A convict with a missing ear replied, "Then he's got poor taste." Jorven struck him in the stomach with the haft of his hammer. The man folded soundlessly. Sigmar also appreciates silence. By noon, the ambush was ready. The dead came at dusk. At first, there was only the drumbeat, slow, wet, patient. Then, the voices. Ah, Oskar Venn, not shouted, not screamed, spoken from many throats at once, somewhere beyond the reeds. Oskar Venn. Holtz licked powder from his thumb. They've grown fond of you. Positions, Venn said. The company sank into hiding. Men crouched behind roots, lay belly down in slime, huddled behind broken earthworks with weapons shaking. Marta disappeared entirely into a nest of reeds. Brother Jorvan stood in the center until Venn grabbed him by the collar and dragged him behind a fallen tree. I do not skulk from abominations, the priest hissed. You do if you want to hit them from the side. That is not skulking. That is righteous repositioning. Call it what you like. The first undead emerged from the mist in file. They did not rush. That was worse. They advanced with careful steps, spears angled low, shields raised against traps they had no reason to know about. At their front limped Ruprecht Fane, or the thing using him. Marta's bolt hole gaped through his face. His jaw hung crooked. When he spoke, his words slopped through broken teeth. Stakes beneath the mud, he said. The dead stopped. Venn's stomach sank. Fane raised one hand and pointed to the first trapline. There. A corpse with an officer's sash knelt and brushed mud aside, revealing the cord Marta had strung. Another dragged a stake free and tossed it away. Around Venn, the company's confidence curdled. They remember, whispered someone. Fane turned his ruined head, sniffing the air like a dog. The woman is left, he said. The cannon is behind a black root. Powder buried in jars, fire in the drunkard's hand. The deadline shifted. A spear flew from the mist. It struck Holtz's assistant, a boy called Nix, who had been sentenced for stealing boots, squarely in the face. The iron point entered beneath his eye and punched out the back of his skull with a wet crack. He dropped without a sound, legs kicking once in the mud. Holtz stared at the boy. Powder spilled from his open hand. The dead charged. Not wildly, not like corpses hungry for flesh. They came like soldiers who had learned exactly where the weak points were. One group surged toward the cannon. Another moved on Marta's reeds. A third drove straight for the half-buried powder jars, shields low, using their own bodies to soak the blast. Venn shouted, "Spring them anyway!" Holtz recovered first. He touched his match cord to the nearest fuse. The swamp erupted. Mud, fire, and bone burst upward in a filthy fountain. One corpse vanished completely. Another landed in pieces across the roots, its torso still crawling, ribs dragging like broken sled runners. A third staggered on with its legs blown away below the knee, walking on splintered shin bones that punched into the mud with every step. But the main charge kept coming. A dead spearman tripped a cord and fell forward onto the sharpened stakes. 3 punched through its chest and back. It hung there, twitching, impaled like a beetle on pins. Then it grabbed the stake through its own belly and pulled itself down the shaft, inch by inch, tearing itself open to get free. Its entrails peeled out in a heavy black rope and slapped into the water. Gold, the branded murderer, rose from behind a root with an axe. "Come on, then." A corpse lunged at him. Gold split its skull from crown to teeth. Another slammed into him from the side, driving a rusted sword through his ribs. Gold roared and headbutted it. His forehead caved in the corpse's nose. He kept swinging, even as a third corpse seized his left arm and bit down. Teeth met through muscle. Gold screamed. The dead thing wrenched its head sideways and ripped away a mouthful of flesh. He brought the axe down and took its face off. Venn had no time to help him. The dead were at the earthwork. A corpse, in rotted mail, came over the top with a halberd. Venn cut at the shaft, missed, and took the hook across his shoulder. Pain burned white through him. The blade tore cloth and skin, dragging him forward. He stepped into the pull instead of away from it, and rammed his sword up beneath the corpse's chin. The point punched through palate and skull. He twisted until bone cracked, then kicked the body backward into 2 more. To his right, Brother Jorven rose with a bellow that shook rain from the branches. "By hammer and flame!" He swung into the flank of the dead. His hammer took one corpse in the knee, bending the joint backward with a crack like breaking firewood. The second blow crushed its head flat against a tree trunk. A dead swordsman stabbed him through the side. Jorven snarled, trapped the blade against his ribs with one arm, and smashed the attacker's wrist until the hand came loose. Then he grabbed the sword still lodged in his own flesh and pulled it free with a grunt. Blood poured down his robe. He looked almost relieved. "That all?" he barked. The dead answered with silence and steel. Marta's reeds thrashed. Venn saw flashes, her knife opening a throat that held no blood worth spilling, her boot pressing a corpse's head underwater, her crossbow jammed beneath a dead man's chin and fired upward. A skull burst apart. She vanished again. Then Fane found her. He came from behind a cypress stump, moving with the jerking wrongness of a puppet dragged on strings. Marta turned too late. His broken hand caught her cloak and yanked her backward. She slashed him across the face. The blade opened one cheek to the ear. "Marta Clegg," Fane bubbled. "Brother hung at Talford. Mother died coughing. You killed the gamekeeper with a snare wire." Marta froze. Fane's other hand closed around her throat. "You cried after." Her face twisted, not with fear, but rage. She drove her thumb into the bolt hole in his mouth and hooked bone. Fane made a noise like mud sucking at boots. Marta screamed in his face and pulled. His jaw tore away in her hand, strings of black flesh snapping loose. She smashed the jawbone into his temple again and again until one side of his head folded inward. Fane still did not fall. Venn reached them and cut through the back of Fane's knee. The corpse dropped. Marta stamped down on its skull. Once, twice, 5 times. The head burst under her heel, spilling grey meat and swamp water. For a heartbeat, the thing lay still. Then its fingers twitched. Venn grabbed Marta by the collar. "Leave it!" They ran as Holtz fired the cannon. The shot was too close. The blast threw living and dead alike into the muck. Venn hit the ground hard enough to drive the breath from him. His ears rang. Hot fragments whipped overhead. A corpse beside him lost both arms and toppled forward, jaw snapping uselessly at the mud. The cannon had punched a hole in the undead advance, but the cost came immediately. They had learned the gun. 4 dead soldiers broke from the mist and went for Holtz in a low rush, shields raised. He tried to swing the barrel around, but the warped wheel stuck. The mule screamed. One corpse hacked into the animal's neck. Blood sprayed across Holtz's face in a steaming sheet. The mule collapsed, kicking, throat open to the spine. Holtz slipped in the blood. The first corpse reached him. It drove a bayonet through his thigh and pinned him to the mud. Holtz screamed through clenched teeth, then smashed his bottle across its face. Glass shattered. Spirits ran over dead flesh. He spat a curse, grabbed his match cord, and touched it to the corpse's oil-soaked uniform. Flame climbed the dead soldier instantly. It did not scream. It leaned down, burning, and tried to bite out Holtz's throat. Jorven arrived like a storm. His hammer smashed the burning corpse aside. A second stabbed at him. He caught the spear under one arm and drove his forehead into the corpse's face, breaking his own skin open. Then he hammered it until its head was nothing but fragments in a helmet. Venn dragged Holtz backward by the collar. The bayonet tore free from his thigh. Blood followed in a dark rush. "My cannon!" Holtz gasped. "Leave it." Holtz grabbed Venn's coat with surprising strength. "I will haunt you. Then move." The ambush had failed. Not entirely, but enough. The dead had lost bodies. Many bodies, but they had learned the traps before springing them. They had identified the cannon. They had used Fane's stolen memories to find Marta. Every casualty the living suffered became another mouth for the enemy to speak through. Venn saw the shape of disaster forming. A disciplined withdrawal would become a massacre. The dead knew discipline. They understood signals, ranks, commands. They would predict every proper movement, because proper movements belonged to soldiers, and soldiers were what they devoured best. So Venn did something improper. He raised his sword and shouted, "Run!" The company stared. "Scatter, you dogs. Every rat for himself. North by the black trees." That they understood. The Mire Company broke apart in a roaring, panicked rush. Convicts vaulted routes, splashed through pools, shoved one another aside. The wounded were hauled or abandoned according to the character of whoever stood nearest. Marta grabbed Holtz under one arm despite his protests. Jorven took the other, leaving red drops behind with every step from the wound in his side. The dead hesitated, only for a moment, but Venn saw it. They had expected retreat by file. They had expected covered withdrawal, rear guard, rally points. Instead they received chaos. Cowards bolting left, smugglers diving into eel channels, murderers turning suddenly to hack at pursuers, drunkards slipping under roots, men screaming contradictory directions. The undead advanced, but the perfect line bent, then stretched, then broke, then ran last. A corpse officer came at him through the smoke, saber raised. Its skull showed through one side of its face. It wore the sash of a regiment long dead, but its stance was fresh, familiar, stolen. It fainted low. Venn recognized the move. The convict duelist from the morning, a man named Stare, had used that exact cut to kill 3 dead before being dragged down. Now the corpse officer used it with Stare's quick wrist and a dead man's patience. Venn barely avoided it. The blade sliced his coat and opened his ribs in a shallow line. He countered with a thrust to the chest. Useless. The officer trapped his sword, twisted, and nearly broke his grip. It knew the duel. It had eaten the lesson. Venn abandoned his sword. The corpse officer paused, confused by the stupidity of it. Venn seized a fistful of mud and shoved it into the thing's remaining eye socket. Then he drove his knee into its pelvis, kicked its leg out, and smashed its head against a root until the skull cracked. Not fencing, not soldiering, gutter work. The corpse twitched beneath him. Venn retrieved his sword and ran. Behind him, the dead called names into the dark. Holzbrenner, Martha Clegg, Brother Jorvan, Goldhof Krudenwald, Oskar Venn. Some of the voices were new. That was the worst part. Near dawn, the survivors reached a strip of higher ground where twisted trees grew from mounds of old stone. Ruins, perhaps. A shrine, perhaps. Everything here had been swallowed and chewed by the swamp until purpose no longer mattered. The company collapsed among the stones. They had entered the mire with 58 souls. 39, answered Venn's count. Of those, 11 were wounded badly enough to die before noon, unless fortune or cruelty intervened. Gold was among the missing. So were 5 smugglers, both handgunners, the boy Nix, 3 deserters, and Vert with the bitten leg. Nobody asked whether they were dead. In the Graven Mire, dead was only the beginning of the question. Holtz lay with his back against a stone, belt tied tight around his thigh. His face was pale beneath the blood. "My cannon?" he asked. "Lost," Venn said. Holtz closed his eyes. "Then we are widowed men." Marta sat nearby, scraping black matter from under her fingernails with a knife. Her hands shook only when she thought no one was watching. Brother Jorvan had stuffed moss and cloth into the wound in his side. He looked grey, but alive, and angry about it. The others stared at Venn from the mud. No one spoke for a long time. Finally Marta said, "You knew at Kappelbruch." Venn looked at her. "The thing with the dead," she continued. "You knew before they called you coward." Rain dripped from the branches. Somewhere far off, a bird screamed and was suddenly silent. Venn lowered himself onto a broken stone. His shoulder throbbed. His ribs burned. He felt older than the swamp. "At Kappelbruch," he said, "we held a redoubt for 6 days. The dead came every night, first like beasts, then like men, then like us. The company listened. On the 2nd night they copied our whistle signals. On the 3rd, they knew where we stored powder. On the 4th, they used the voice of my sergeant to order men down from the wall. On the 5th, they formed ranks under fire and advanced by platoon because they had killed enough of us to learn how." Holtz opened one eye. "And the 6th? Venn's mouth tightened. "On the 6th, I ordered retreat." "Saved 49, Marta said. "Lost the rest. Would have lost all." The tribunal disagreed. Brother Jorvan stared at him. "Why did no one believe you?" "Because men prefer a coward they can hang," To a truth they cannot fight. That settled over them heavily. A wounded convict began to weep, not loudly, just a steady leaking of grief and terror as he clutched the stump where his left hand had been. No one mocked him. No one had the strength. Then, from the swamp below, came a voice. "Captain!" Every head turned. At the edge of the higher ground stood Golt. The branded murderer swayed in the mist. His left arm hung in ribbons, bitten almost to the bone. His belly was open. His intestines glistened in loops, held up in both hands like an offering. His eyes were dead, but his mouth smiled with all the warmth of a grave. Behind him stood the others. Nix with the spear hole through his face, Wirt with his calf torn open, the handgunners, the deserters, the missing smugglers, all of them pale, all of them wet, all of them watching. Golt's corpse spoke in a voice that was partly his and partly something deeper. "You run badly," it said. "You hide badly. You fear beautifully." The dead behind him raised their weapons. Venn stood. The survivors scrambled upright, groaning, bleeding, cursing. Marta loaded her crossbow. Jorvan lifted his hammer. Holtz tried to rise, failed, and dragged a powder flask into his lap instead. Venn looked at his miserable company. Convicts, drunkards, deserters, poachers, smugglers, sinners, broken tools, bad soldiers. Perhaps that was why some of them still lived. The dead had learned war. So Venn would give them filth. He raised his sword toward Golt's corpse. "Listen well, you grave-fed bastard," he said. "We're done fighting like soldiers." The dead advanced up the stones, and the Mire company, snarling from the mud, prepared to fight like animals. Chapter 3. The General in the Mire. The dead came up the stones with the patience of things that had forgotten pain. Golt led them, or the thing wearing Golt did. His belly was split from breastbone to groin, and his intestines dragged beneath him in glistening ropes that slapped wetly against the old masonry. Every few steps he stooped with corpse-stiff fingers, gathered his own innards, and stuffed them back into the wound. They spilled out again at once. He did not seem troubled by it. Behind him came Nix, the boot thief boy, the spear hole through his face making a second mouth beneath his eye. Wirt limped, with half a calf missing, the white of his bitten shin showing through strips of meat. The dead handgunners came, with their weapons reversed like clubs. The deserters came with swamp water pouring from their sleeves. They had been men of the Mire company less than an hour ago. Now they climbed to kill their own. Venn did not order a formation. He did not call ranks, files, volley, brace, wheel, or hold. Instead, he spat blood into the mud and shouted, "Break them!" The company broke them badly. A convict hurled a stone the size of a child's skull into Nix's face. The boy's corpse staggered, the hole through his cheek widening as bone crunched inward. Marta came from the side with a hatchet and chopped his knee out. Nix fell. She stamped once on the back of his neck, twice, then drove the hatchet so deep into his skull that the blade stuck and she had to leave it there. Wirt lunged at Brother Jorvan, fingers hooked, mouth open. The priest met him with a roar and brought his hammer down on Wirt's shoulder. The joint burst. The arm came away in a spray of black blood and yellow marrow. Wirt kept coming. Jorvan struck him again, this time in the ribs, and the whole left side of the corpse folded like a kicked-in barrel. Still it crawled, still it hissed. "Sigmar burn you hollow," Jorven growled, and smashed Vert's head flat against the stones. Holtz, pale and shaking from the wound in his thigh, sat braced against a broken pillar with a powder flask between his knees. A dead handgunner stumbled toward him. Holtz waited until it was close enough for him to smell the grave water in its lungs, then flung a handful of loose powder into its face and thrust his smoldering match into the cloud. The corpse's head vanished in a flash of white fire. Holtz blinked, eyebrows singed away. "I meant to do that." The fight became a butcher's scramble among the ruins. No clean lines, no proud charges, no flags snapping in the wind. Men slipped in mud and fought from their knees. Knives went into bellies and throats. Teeth snapped. Fingers broke. A convict named Lenk caught one dead deserter by the hair and slammed its face repeatedly into a stone until the skull opened and grey matter smeared across the moss. The corpse still clawed at him. Lenk screamed and used both thumbs to gouge out its eyes, then bit its nose off in a fury and spat the rotten thing away. The dead had learned soldiers. They had not learned this. Golt came for Venn. The corpse moved with the murderous strength he had possessed in life, but without the impatience. He raised his axe, the same axe that had carved through dead men at the ambush, now turned against the living. Venn ducked the first swing. The blade struck a stone beside his head and threw sparks. He drove his sword into Golt's stomach, but there was little left inside to wound. The blade slid through empty gut and out the spine. Golt smiled. "Captain," he said, with mud bubbling between his teeth, "you leave men behind." Venn tore the sword free. "Only the slow ones." Golt swung again. Venn stepped back too late. The axe bit into his left forearm, not deep enough to sever, but deep enough to open him to the bone. Fire shot up to his shoulder. His fingers spasmed. He nearly dropped the sword. Golt leaned close. His breath smelled of drowned meat. "You fear names," the corpse whispered. "You fear remembering." Venn slammed his forehead into Golt's broken nose. Bone crunched. Pain burst white behind Venn's eyes. He did it again and again. Then he hooked his boot behind Golt's ankle and drove him backward over the edge of a submerged stair. Golt fell into the black water below. Something under the surface took him. There was no splash of struggle. The swamp simply closed over him with a thick gulp. The remaining dead faltered, not in fear, never fear, in calculation. That was when Sanna Reedknife, last leader of the eel rats, rose from a crack in the ruins behind them. She and 2 smugglers had vanished during the first charge, leaving everyone to assume cowardice. Now they came up from a drainage hollow, like knives drawn from a sleeve. Sanna drove a hooked blade through the back of a corpse's neck and ripped sideways. The head rolled off in a wet tumble. Her men dragged another dead deserter down into the hole with them. It vanished, thrashing, while muffled chopping sounds echoed below. "Tunnel!" Sanna barked. "Unless you'd rather stay and court them?" Venn needed no second urging. "Move!" They fled into the old drainage hollow one by one, slipping down stones slick with moss and grave slime. The dead pressed after them. A woman convict fell at the entrance when a corpse seized her hair. She screamed once before 3 dead men piled onto her. Venn saw her hand claw at the air, saw teeth close on her wrist, saw her fingers peel backward as the bones broke. Marta tried to reach her, but Jorven dragged Marta down the tunnel bodily. "Gone!" he snapped. The woman's scream followed them until it changed. By then, it was no longer hers. The tunnel beneath the ruins had once belonged to men who believed stone could master water. They had been wrong. Roots had split the walls, mud pushed between the blocks. In places, the passage narrowed until men had to crawl through cold slime on their bellies. Beetles scattered beneath their hands. Pale worms hung from cracks and writhed against faces as the company squeezed past. The eel rats led without torches. They knew by touch, smell, and the faint motion of air. Behind them, the dead entered the tunnel. Everyone heard them, armor scraping stone, fingers dragging through muck, voices whispering names into the dark. Marta Clegg, Holtz Brenner, Brother Jorven, Oskar Venn. Then another voice, fresh and wet from the woman left at the entrance. "Please," it called. "Please, I am still alive." No one stopped. A young convict began sobbing. "She's alive." Marta slapped him so hard his head struck the wall. "No, she isn't." The voice behind them laughed with the woman's throat. They crawled for what felt like hours. Holtz left a dark smear from his wounded thigh along the stones. Jorven's breathing became rough and bubbling. Venn's arm throbbed until each heartbeat felt like a hammer blow inside the wound. Twice the tunnel shook as something heavy moved above them. Once a dead hand punched through the ceiling and grabbed a man by the scalp. He shrieked as it pulled upward, skin tearing from his forehead in a red flap. Venn chopped through the wrist, and the severed hand fell, still clutching hair and strips of scalp. At last, the tunnel opened. They crawled out beneath a sky the color of old bruises. The heart of the Graven Mire lay before them. No map had named it. No road had reached it. The swamp opened into a vast, drowned basin, a battlefield swallowed by centuries of mud and rain. Broken siege towers leaned from the water like the ribs of dead giants. Rusted helmets floated in mats of weed. Spears jutted from the mire by the hundreds, their points blackened and bent. Here and there, old banners hung from trees, colorless and rotten, their devices eaten away by damp and age. The ground was not ground at all, but layers of bodies, armor, timber, roots, and silt pressed together into a trembling skin. At the center of the basin stood a command pavilion. It should have rotted away long ago. Instead, it remained half submerged and vast, made from stitched hides, old canvas, bones, and regimental flags sewn together with black cord. Lanterns burned inside it with corpse-green flame. Around it stood ranks of the dead, thousands. Some were little more than skeletons in rusted mail. Some were fresh, their faces still recognizable beneath mud and bites. Some wore imperial buff coats. Some wore mercenary scraps. Some wore the uniforms of border princes, dead rebels, broken state troops, nameless militias, and armies forgotten by everyone except the soil that had eaten them. They did not moan. They did not shuffle. They waited. Holtz stared. That is a discouraging amount of dead. Brother Jorven wiped blood from his beard. All abominations end beneath the hammer. You may need a larger hammer. Venn said nothing. He was looking at the pavilion. A table stood inside. Around it gathered corpses in officers' coats. Generals, captains, sergeants, priests, engineers, scouts, duelists, all dead, all leaning over maps made from stretched human skin, their mouths opened and closed though no breath moved in their lungs. They argued in whispers that carried across the water. Left flank refused. No, draw them through the causeway. Powder low, morale failing, human irregularity increasing. Adapt. At the head of the table stood the thing that commanded. It was tall, but not because it had been born tall. It had been assembled. Its body was built from officers' corpses layered and fused together, uniforms stitched into flesh, medals hammered into ribs, epaulets pinned through muscle. One shoulder wore a dead general's coat. The other bore a breastplate, split by cannon shot. Its skull was crowned not with gold, but with broken sword hilts driven into bone like a fan of iron horns. Faces moved beneath its skin, not on it. Beneath it, cheeks bulged, eyes pressed outward, mouths formed under the stretched flesh and vanished again. When it turned its head, Venn saw 6 expressions ripple across the same dead features: rage, calculation, grief, arrogance, terror, contempt. The Namarch. No one spoke the name aloud, but all of them knew it. It lifted one hand across the basin. Every corpse turned toward the Mire company. Marta whispered, "How does it know we're here?" Venn watched the pavilion. "Because we brought ourselves," the Minemash spoke. Its voice came not from one throat, but from many. It was a council, a court, an army staff, and a mass grave, all speaking through the same mouth. Oskar Venn. The name rolled across the basin. Dead soldiers repeated it rank by rank, until the swamp itself seemed to murmur, "Oskar Venn." Venn stepped from the tunnel mouth into the open. Marta grabbed his sleeve. "Don't. They already know where we are. They know too much." "Yes." The Mnemash tilted its head. "You returned," it said. "The captain who ran." Venn's jaw tightened. Around him, the company gathered in the shadow of the broken battlefield, 30-odd souls against a drowned army. They looked like vermin at the edge of a slaughterhouse, mud-caked, blood-smeared, half-starved, eyes too bright with terror. Yet none ran. The tunnel behind them had filled with dead whispers. The basin before them held worse. The Mnemarch extended both arms. The pavilion shifted. The dead officers around the table began speaking in voices Venn knew. Sergeant Albrecht from Kappelbruch, throat torn out but words clean as parade drill. You ordered withdrawal at third bell. Young File, who had died holding the powder room door. You said you would return. Old cast, drummer boy, 12 years old, skull crushed by a falling beam. Captain, why did you leave me? Venn stood very still. The voices struck more deeply than blades. He could feel every eye of the company on him. This was the true weapon of the dead. Not claw, tooth, spear, or spell. Memory. Theft made into war. Brother Jorvan stepped beside him, pale and bleeding. Lies, the priest said. Venn's voice was rough. No, they are memories. The Mnemash smiled with 3 mouths at once. We keep what war discards, it said. Every order, every fear, every oath broken in the mud. Men die screaming, and we remember for them. Holtz leaned on Marta, face gray. Sentimental thing, isn't it? The Mnemach's eyes shifted to him. Holzbrenner, master gunner, court-martialed for drunken negligence. 17 dead in the powder yard at Bogenhafen. Holtz stopped smiling. They were already dead, he said softly. No, the Mnemarch replied with Holtz's own voice. But you were drunk enough to hope so. Holtz's hands began to tremble. Marta raised her crossbow, but Venn pushed it down. Not yet. The Mnemarch turned to her. Marta Clegg, poacher, murderer, loved her brother more than law. Hanged men twitch long after the neck breaks, do they not? Marta bared her teeth. Come closer and learn. A ripple passed through the Mnemarch. Amusement, perhaps, or hunger. It looked at Brother Jorven. Faithful dog, you struck a noble for mocking death, but not because of piety, because he laughed like your father. Jorven flinched as if hit. The company began to shake apart, not physically, worse, inside. Men who could face teeth and rusted blades began looking at the mud as if wishing to crawl into it. The Mnemarch was opening them with words, peeling them layer by layer. Every dead comrade had made it sharper. Every kill had given it another hook. Venn understood then that no army could beat it for long. Not a proper army. Not state troops. Not mercenaries. Not knights. Not disciplined halberdiers with clean banners and proud captains. The Mnemarch would kill 1, learn 10, kill 10, learn 100. Every tactic became food. Every formation became memory. War itself nourished it. So he looked at what he had. A drunk gunner with 1 leg leaking blood. A poacher with rage enough to warm the mire. A disgraced priest held together by spite and bad stitching. Smugglers who knew tunnels better than prayers. Murderers, thieves, deserters, debtors, liars, cowards. The worst soldiers in the empire. Perhaps the best possible army for this. Venn turned his back on the Mnemarch and faced them. Listen, he said quietly. The company stared. Some were crying. Some were praying. Some were gripping weapons until their knuckles split. That thing knows soldiers. So no more soldiering. No ranks. No clean charges. No orders it can swallow and spit back. You fight dirty. You lie. You scatter. You feint surrender. You stab from holes. You use hooks, mud, teeth, powder, smoke, and cowardice. Especially cowardice. If you want to run, run somewhere useful and drag 3 dead bastards after you. A few of them laughed. Not because it was funny, because they needed it to be. Venn pointed at Sana Reedknife. Find every eel tunnel under this basin, she nodded. At dusk, your people cut through the roots beneath that pavilion. To do what? Make it sink. Venn pointed at Holtz. Powder? Holtz swallowed, color slowly returning to his face. Some, not enough. Find more. In a swamp full of dead armies, there will be powder stores. Old, wet, useless. Holtz's grin returned, ragged and unpleasant. Wet powder is only useless to pessimists. Venn turned to Brother Jorven. Keep them angry. The priest wiped blood from the corner of his mouth. That is the first sensible order you've given. Marta. She looked up. You take 6. Left rim. Kill officers. Anything with a sash, plume, map case, or too much confidence. What about you? Venn looked back at the pavilion. The Mnemarch watched him. I give it something it wants. Marta's eyes narrowed. No. Yes. It'll take your memories. That is the idea. That is the stupidest idea I have ever heard. Then it won't expect it. Before she could answer, the dead attacked. Not the whole army, just enough. A wave of corpses surged from the nearest ranks, splashing through the flooded basin. They came fast, weapons raised, mouths closed. No taunts now, no names. The Mne March had heard enough. The Mire company scattered. A proper army would have died. The convicts survived by becoming chaos. Martyr's Six vanished into reeds and began killing from the side. Crossbow bolts snapped into skulls, knees, throats. The eel rats slipped into water channels and cut ankles beneath the surface. Corpses toppled, then disappeared as hooks dragged them down into the dark. Holtz found an abandoned powder wagon half sunk beside a siege tower and began cackling like a lunatic, scooping black sludge into sacks. Jorven stood atop a mound of shields and roared scripture until his voice cracked. "Come then! Come, you grave-born filth! I have sins enough for all of you!" The dead obliged. They climbed toward him. He met them with hammer and boot. A corpse thrust a spear through his shoulder. He snapped the shaft, pulled himself along it, and crushed the attacker's skull with a two-handed blow. Another bit into his forearm. He hammered its head against his own arm until teeth flew loose and its jaw broke away. Blood ran down him in sheets, but he stayed upright, less a priest than a wounded bear wrapped in faith. Venn moved through the chaos toward the pavilion. Two corpses blocked him. He threw his sword at the first. It struck hilt first, uselessly, but the absurdity made the corpse hesitate. Venn tackled the second into the mud, jammed his thumbs beneath its jaw, and wrenched until the head twisted backward. He took its knife and used it on the first, hacking at the spine until it dropped. Not soldiering, butchery. The pavilion loomed ahead. The dead officers inside turned as he entered. Their stitched maps glistened in green lantern light. Pins made from finger bones marked positions across the swamp. Red thread showed routes of attack. Black thread showed where men had died. At the far end stood the Mne Mark. Close, it was worse. Venn could smell it. Old armor, grave soil, candle wax, and the sour rot of opened coffins. The faces beneath its skin pressed outward, each trying to speak. He saw Albrecht, Feil, Karst, men from Kappelbruch, men he had ordered to hold, men he had abandoned to save what little could be saved. The Mne March opened its arms. "You offer command," it said. Venn gripped the stolen knife. "I offer a lesson." The dead officers closed around him. Venn fought. He cut the throat from one and kicked another into the map table. A corpse captain seized his wounded arm. Pain blinded him. He drove the knife into its ear and twisted until its skull split around the blade. A dead sergeant hammered a fist into his ribs. Something cracked. Venn fell to one knee. He rose with a snarl and bit the sergeant's hand, tearing loose a strip of cold flesh. Then the Mne March moved. Its hand struck him across the chest. Not a punch. A command, given through bone. Venn flew backward into the table. Skin maps tore beneath him. Fingerbone pins stabbed into his back. He rolled, gasping, but dead hands pinned him down. Outside, explosions thudded through the mire. Holtz had found fire. Screams rose, living and dead together. The pavilion floor shifted slightly as something beneath it groaned. The Mne March leaned over Venn. Your mind is full of retreat, it said. Venn spat blood into its face. My mind is full of officers. The Mnemarch's fingers closed around his skull. Cold entered him, not like winter, like burial, like earth packed into the mouth. Memories tore open inside him, Kappelbruch burning, men screaming at the gate, his sergeant shouting for permission to countercharge. The dead using that same sergeant's voice, an hour later. The redoubt, overrun. Venn ordering retreat. Venn looking back. Venn seeing Karst, the drummer boy, standing on the wall with blood on his face, calling for him. The Mnemarch drank. Its many mouths sighed. Yes, it whispered. Command, guilt, failure, strategy, fear. We will use you well. Venn looked past it, through the torn pavilion wall. He saw Marta in the reeds, looking at him. He saw Holtz dragging a sack of powder sludge beneath a hanging chapel bell, half buried in the mire. He saw Sanna reed-knife smugglers vanishing under the pavilion supports, with knives between their teeth. He saw Brother Jorven, bleeding from half a dozen wounds, laughing as he dragged 3 dead men down with him and rose again. Venn smiled through bloody teeth. The Mnemarch paused. What is this? Venn let the memories open wider. Not the clean ones, not maps, not formations, not signals or doctrine. He gave it panic, shame, contradiction, drunken songs from prison wagons, the stink of Holtz's breath, Marta's fury, Jorven's shovel striking a noble's face, Golt biting a corpse's nose off, men running in every direction, cowardice turned sideways into survival, orders given too late, orders disobeyed correctly, filth, noise, pain, human stupidity, human spite. The Mnemarch recoiled half an inch. Outside, the first pavilion support cracked. Venn laughed, though it hurt enough to make his vision swim. You wanted a general, he rasped, choke on one. The dead officer seized him harder. The Mnemarch's fingers dug into his scalp until blood ran into his eyes. Bind him, it commanded. Preserve the captain. Take the others. Learn the rabble. Burn the irregularity away. Dead hands dragged Venn upright. He did not resist. The Mnemarch turned toward the battlefield, toward the convicts and drunkards and deserters tearing its careful war into pieces, its stolen faces twisted into one expression, not fear, not yet, but uncertainty. For the first time in the Graven Mire, the dead did not know what came next. Chapter 4. Mud takes all the Mnemarch, bound Oskar Venn with the hands of dead officers. They dragged him through the command pavilion and nailed him upright against a frame made from broken pikes, cavalry lances, and old banner poles. Rusted points punched through his coat and bit into the meat beneath his ribs. Barbed hooks were forced through the sleeves at his shoulders, pinning his arms wide. One corpse held his head back by the hair, while another wrapped a chain around his throat, tight enough to make every breath a labor. The pavilion groaned around them, beneath the floor. Sanna reed-knife and her eel-rats were cutting through roots and supports. Venn could feel each shudder through the poles at his back. The whole structure leaned a little farther with every crack of wet timber. Outside, the basin had become a slaughter pit. Powder smoke rolled across the drowned battlefield in dirty clouds. Green corpse lanterns swung wildly from hooks. Dead soldiers marched in from the mire, but no line held for long. The Mire Company fought like a riot, like an outbreak, like a tavern brawl conducted in a charnel house, and still they were dying. Venn heard them. A convict screamed as something tore his arm away. A smuggler cursed until the curse became a bubbling choke. Brother Jorven's voice rose above it all, half hymn, half animal bellow. Marta shouted orders that were not orders at all, just threats with directions attached. Hulse laughed somewhere in the smoke, which meant either victory or imminent disaster. The name arch stood before Venn, too tall, beneath the low pavilion roof, its crown of broken sword hilts scraping the hide ceiling. Faces pressed and swam beneath its stretched skin. Men Venn had known, men he had failed, men who had died in mud, fire, fear, and obedience. "You resist poorly," the Mnemarch said. Its voice was crowded now. Hundreds of officers spoke inside it, disagreeing and agreeing in the same breath. Venn spat blood onto its breastplate. "I was always a disappointment." One of the dead captains struck him across the mouth. His lip split against his teeth. Warm blood filled his mouth. He swallowed some and choked on the rest. The Mnemarch laid a long grey hand against his forehead. "Open." The word was not sound. It was command, cold and absolute, driven through his skull like a spike. Venn's mind split. Kappelbruch returned first. It always did. The redoubt burning in winter rain, powder magazines coughing flame, men packed shoulder to shoulder on the parapet, firing down into the dark. Dead things climbing with ladders made from other dead things. Sergeant Albrecht shouting that the left wall would hold. Young Karst beating the drum with bleeding hands because no one had told him to stop. Then the dead speaking with Albrecht's voice. The dead calling the password. The dead ordering the gate opened. Venn smelled smoke. He smelled cooked flesh beneath armor. He heard the wet chop of axes in the dark. The Mnemarch drank it all. Its many mouths sighed. "Useful," it whispered. Signal codes, redoubt, fallbacks, powder discipline, emergency withdrawal patterns. Venn grinned through blood. "You still think that's what I'm giving you?" Then he shoved deeper. He gave it everything he hated. Not battle plans, not clean maps, not noble speeches. He gave it the stink of the prison wagon, men farting in chains and singing obscene songs because terror had to come out somehow. He gave it Hulse vomiting into a powder bucket and then improving the cannon fuse with trembling fingers. He gave it Marta crying over her hanged brother and then strangling a man with wire. He gave it Jorven smashing a nobleman's face with a shovel and feeling more faith in that blow than in 10 years of sermons. He gave it cowardice. Men running, men slipping, men hiding under corpses, men surviving because they were too frightened to obey. He gave it contradiction. A murderer sharing water with a wounded boy. A deserter standing firm for 3 seconds too long. A priest cursing the God he loved. A captain ordering retreat and calling it duty while feeling it rot inside him. The Mnemarch stiffened. Beneath its skin, faces began to press harder. Mouths formed and vanished. One voice ordered advance. Another ordered withdrawal. Another demanded the left flank turn. Another insisted the enemy had no left flank because the enemy was a drunk with a powder sack crawling through sewage. Outside, the swamp exploded. The blast lifted half the pavilion from its supports. Hide walls bulged outward. Bone pegs snapped. A table made of stitched skin flipped into the air, scattering finger bone pins like dice. Dead officers were hurled across the chamber. One struck a lantern and caught fire, green flame crawling up its uniform while it tried to continue giving orders through a melting face. Holtz had found his powder. Venn laughed until the chain at his throat cut the sound short. The Mnemarch turned, smoke boiling around its shoulders. Across the basin, Holtz Brenner stood atop the half-sunk chapel bell, one leg bandaged black, one hand clutching a smoking match cord, the other raised in an obscene salute. Around him lay the remains of a powder cache old enough to have become sludge. He had packed it with dry grains scraped from cartridges, lamp oil, grave cloth, and whatever else would burn. The explosion had not been clean. It had been ugly, slow, and wet. It had thrown burning mud in every direction. Dead soldiers staggered through the flames. Some had no heads, some had no arms. One walked with its torso opened like a cupboard, ribs spread wide and burning inside. Another dragged itself by its fingers while its legs kicked uselessly behind it, separated from the hips by the blast. The undead did not scream, but their armor shrieked as heat twisted it. Holtz slipped from the bell, landed badly, and vanished behind smoke as 3 corpses rushed him. Marta appeared first. She came out of the reeds low and fast, cloak torn, hair plastered to her skull, one cheek opened from ear to chin. A dead pikeman turned toward her. She threw a knife into its eye, ducked beneath the point, and drove her shoulder into its knees. When it fell, she climbed onto its back and hacked at the spine with a butcher's cleaver until the head and body stopped agreeing with each other. A second corpse caught her by the throat. She slammed both thumbs into its mouth and tore downward. The jaw cracked free with a sound like a branch snapping under ice. She spat in its face and kicked it into a burning pool. "Holtz!" she shouted. The artilleryman crawled from under a corpse, stabbing upward repeatedly with a broken ramrod. The dead thing on top of him jerked with each blow, but kept clawing for his face. Marta seized it by the collar and pulled. Holtz drove the ramrod through its temple with both hands. The point emerged from the far side trailing black jelly. "My thanks," he wheezed. "Get up. I am emotionally attached to the ground." She kicked him. He got up. The Mnemarch watched it happen. Its fingers twitched. Around it, the dead army tried to realign, tried to make sense of ambushes from beneath water, false retreats, scattered charges, powder blasts, and madmen who obeyed no rhythm but panic. "Reform," it commanded. The dead ranks obeyed. For 3 heartbeats, the basin became an army again. Then Sanna Reedknife cut the last support beneath the pavilion. The command tent sank, not all at once. First, the floor dipped. Water gurgled through seams between planks. Maps slid from tables. Lanterns swung. Dead officers stumbled, their boots trapped in muck rising from below. Then the rear of the pavilion collapsed with a wet roar, dragging hides, bones, banners, and corpses into the mire. Venn's frame lurched backward. The barbs in his shoulders tore deeper. Pain burst through him so sharply that the world went white. He felt flesh rip along his left arm. Blood ran hot under his coat. He bit down on his own tongue to stop from screaming and tasted copper. A dead officer lost balance beside him and fell into the water. Something below seized it. Not hands, roots perhaps, or bones. The corpse vanished vertically, sucked down in a single smooth motion, helmet last. The Mnemarch turned on Venn. Its face had changed. Uncertainty had become rage. "You contaminate command." Venn dragged breath through the chain. "You wanted war. Remembered." The pavilion sank another foot. The Mnemarch came close enough that Venn could see the dead eyes moving beneath its cheeks. "We remember every soldier we kill. Then remember this." Venn tore his right arm free. The hook through his sleeve had not gone through flesh as deeply as the left. Cloth ripped. Skin stripped from his wrist. He felt something in his shoulder give way with a nauseating pop. But the arm came loose. He caught one of the broken pike shafts from the frame and drove it into the Mnemarch's neck. The point punched through dead flesh and scraped bone. The Mnemarch did not fall. It seized Venn by the chest and ripped him off the frame. The remaining hooks tore free from his coat and skin. One barb carved a red trench across his ribs. Another tore a strip from his upper arm. He hit the sinking floor hard enough to crack his jaw against the planks. The Mnemarch lifted him with one hand. Venn dangled, boots scraping water, choking as its fingers closed around his throat. "Captain," it said, now using Sergeant Albrecht's voice. "Order withdrawal." Venn's eyes bulged. Black spots crowded his vision. "No. Order. Withdraw." Now, Cast's voice. Young. Afraid. Impossible. "Captain, please." The grip tightened. Venn's hand found something beneath the water. A sword, broken near the middle. Rusted. Useless for a soldier. Good enough for a man in mud. He drove the jagged blade into the Mnemarch's armpit, up under the breastplate where old uniforms and stitched meat met. It slid in deep. Something inside the undead general shifted and tore. Several of its mouths opened at once. Venn twisted. The Mnemarch hurled him away. He crashed through a hide wall and rolled down the collapsing pavilion slope into the battlefield outside. Mud swallowed him to the chest. For a moment he could not move. Rain struck his face. Smoke crawled above him. The world was screams, drums, fire, and the endless tramp of dead feet. His left arm hung useless. His ribs felt loose inside him. Every breath came with a knife. A corpse stepped toward him with a spear. Before it could strike, Brother Jorven hit it from the side. The priest was almost unrecognizable. His robe hung in red rags. His beard was matted black. One eye had swollen half shut. A spearhead still jutted from his shoulder, the shaft broken off. He hammered the corpse once in the chest, once in the face, then kicked its legs out and brought the hammer down until skull, helmet, and mud became one shapeless mess. "Stand," Jorven growled. Venn tried. His legs failed. Jorven grabbed him with one hand and hauled him upright. "I said stand." Venn stood. Across the basin, the Mnemarch emerged from the ruined pavilion. It dragged the broken pike shaft from its neck and cast it aside. The wound did not bleed. Faces writhed under its skin. In frantic motion now, dozens shouting silent commands. Behind it, dead officers clawed their way from the sinking wreckage. Around it, the undead army gathered. But the ground beneath them was changing. The explosions had cracked the old battlefield crust. The cut roots no longer held. Water welled upward in black jets. Mud bubbled. Ancient bones shifted below the surface. The center of the basin was becoming a mouth. Sanna reed knife appeared beside Venn, bleeding from the scalp. "The whole middle's hollow." Venn looked at the Mnemarch. "How deep?" Sanna smiled with red teeth. "Deep enough for sins." The undead advanced. The final charge of the Mire Company was not glorious. It was filthy, desperate, and half-mad. Marta led the first rush, screaming like a fox in a trap, 6 survivors behind her. They did not aim to kill. They aimed to shove. Hooks caught dead soldiers behind the knees. Spears jabbed into ribs and pushed. Men threw themselves bodily into corpses and drove them toward the sucking center. One convict had his hand bitten clean off and kept punching with the stump, spraying blood across a dead man's face until Marta drove a cleaver through its spine. Holtz limped forward with a powder keg hugged to his chest. "Holtz!" Venn shouted. The gunner looked offended. "I know what I'm doing. You never know what you're doing." "Yes, but magnificently." He stumbled beneath a dead cavalryman's strike. The sword carved across his back, opening him from shoulder to hip. Holtz fell to one knee, gasped, then shoved the keg beneath the corpse's feet and thrust his match into the fuse. Marta tackled him away just before it blew. The blast tore a crater through the dead line. Corpse cavalry and foot soldiers vanished in a geyser of mud and bones. Holtz and Marta rolled across the ground, both smoking, both alive, mostly. Brother Jorven waded straight into the thickest knot of dead, swinging his hammer in great ruined arcs. A corpse thrust a sword through his stomach. He stepped closer down the blade and crushed its skull. Another seized his hammer arm. He headbutted it until his forehead split open. A third climbed onto his back and sank teeth into his neck. Jorven roared, reached over his shoulder, grabbed it by the skull, and hurled it into the mire. "Sigmar!" he bellowed, though by then it sounded less like a prayer than a challenge. The dead closed around him. Venn tried to reach him, but Jorven saw and shook his head. The priest smiled. Then he drove his hammer down into the mud at his own feet, striking the half-buried chapel bell Holtz had rigged with a final charge beneath the muck. The explosion took Brother Jorven and 30 corpses with him. For one instant he was a black shape inside white fire, hammer raised, mouth open in laughter or prayer. Then the blast tore him apart. His hammer spun through the smoke and landed at Venn's feet, its head cracked, its haft burning. The detonation broke the basin. The center collapsed. Mud, water, corpses, roots, stones, banners, and bones all began to slide inward. Dead soldiers lost footing and vanished. Some clawed at the ground. Some were dragged by the weight of those behind them. The mire opened in rings, sucking down the old battlefield layer by layer. The Mnemach stood at the edge, braced against the pull. It looked at Venn. All its faces spoke at once. Oskar Venn. Venn picked up Jorven's hammer. It was too heavy for his ruined arm. He carried it anyway. Marta appeared beside him, limping. Holtz crawled up on the other side, one eye swollen shut, laughing weakly. Sanna and the last eel rats rose from the water behind the Mnemach, hooks ready. "No more orders?" Marta asked. "One more," Venn said. She looked at him. "Live badly." Then he charged. The Mnemach came to meet him. Its first blow struck Venn across the chest and hurled him sideways. He hit the mud, rolled, rose, somehow. Marta fired a crossbow bolt into the Mnemach's knee. Holtz flung a flask of burning spirits into its face. Sanna's hooks caught its trailing coat and pulled from behind. The Mnemach staggered. Venn swung Jorven's hammer with both hands. Pain tore through his left shoulder so savagely he nearly blacked out, but the hammer landed. It smashed into the Mnemach's breastplate, caving metal into dead ribs, Faces beneath its skin screamed, then swung again. This time he hit the crown of broken sword hilts. Iron snapped, bone cracked. One of the buried faces burst through the cheek, mouth opening wide in a silent howl. The Mnemarch seized him. Together they fell into the mire. Cold closed over Venn's legs, then his waist. The mud pulled with impossible strength. The Mnemarch's hands locked around his shoulders, dragging him down. Its faces pressed close. "We remember," it hissed. "We remember all soldiers." Venn laughed, though mud filled his mouth. Beneath them, the deep mire stirred. The Mnemarch reached for the memories of the dead buried there. It found them. Not soldiers, not officers, not disciplined minds. With orders and maps, he'd found nameless camp followers trampled under retreating horses. Children drowned when dikes were cut. Peasants pressed into labor and left in fever pits. Prisoners executed and forgotten. Wounded men who had never known which side killed them. Women with no banners. Boys with no swords. Old men buried under siege spoil. Thousands upon thousands of the unwanted dead, packed beneath the battlefield in layers of fear, hunger, confusion, and rage. The Mnemarch opened itself to remember them, and they poured in. Its body convulsed. Faces erupted across its flesh, not officers now but the forgotten. Toothless mouths, sunken eyes, broken jaws, screaming children, starving mothers, nameless laborers, executed thieves, plague-bloated peasants. None had tactics, none had drill, none had clean orders to steal. They had only pain. The Mnemarch tried to command them. The mire answered by pulling harder. Venn felt its grip loosen. He slammed Jorvan's hammer into its face one last time. The skull split. The Mnemarch sank, still twitching, still crowded with screaming faces. Its crown vanished first, then its shoulders. Then one grey hand thrust up from the mud. Fingers spread as though reaching for a banner that was no longer there. The swamp swallowed it. Silence came slowly. The drums stopped. Across the basin the undead army sagged. Some collapsed where they stood, bones falling apart inside armor. Others sank into the mud without resistance. A few remained upright for several seconds, like puppets waiting for strings, then toppled into the water. The corpse lanterns guttered out one by one. Venn lay in the mire, unable to move. Marta and Sanna dragged him free before the mud could decide he belonged to it. He came out with a sound like a cork pulled from a bottle, coughing black water and blood. Holtz collapsed beside him, wheezing. "Did we win?" Holtz asked. Marta looked across the drowned battlefield. "No." Venn rolled onto his back. The sky above the Graven Mire had begun to pale. Not clear, never clear, just less black. "We survived," he said. Holtz considered this. Cheap substitute. At dawn, 17 members of the Mire Company staggered out of the swamp. 17 from 58. They carried no proper banner. The old penal cloth had been lost, burned, or eaten by the mire. Brother Jorvan was gone. Golt was gone. Ruprecht Fane was gone. Dozens of names were gone, though the swamp had tried very hard to keep them. At the road to Fort Mackenhof, the state troops still held the barricade. The handgunners stared as the survivors emerged from the fog. Mud-caked, blood-slick, limping, half-dead and wild-eyed. Marta walked with one arm around Holtz, who kept insisting he could walk and repeatedly proving otherwise. Sanna carried a sack of stolen teeth and officers' medals. Venn came last, Jorven's cracked hammer in one hand. Marshal Adjutant Kessel stood behind the barricade, immaculate as ever. His eyes moved over them. "Captain Venn," he called. "Report." Venn stopped 10 paces from the guns. The survivors gathered behind him. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Venn tossed a ruined object into the mud before the barricade. It was one of the Neymarch's broken sword hilts, still lodged in a chunk of skull. "The source is destroyed," Venn said. Kessel stared at it, then at the survivors. "Your company will submit to quarantine and debriefing. Weapons down. Prisoners will be returned to custody pending review." The Mire company did not move. Marta slowly loaded her crossbow. Holtz smiled through cracked lips. Sanna's smugglers melted slightly outward, hands near knives. Venn looked at the barricade, the guns, the clean uniforms. Then he looked back at the swamp. Behind them, the Graven Mire steamed in the morning light, silent and full. "No," he said. Kessel blinked. "No, no. You're still under sentence." Venn tore the blackened penal parchment from inside his coat. It was soaked with blood and swamp water. He held it up, then dropped it into the mud and ground it beneath his boot. "Then hang me," he said. "But you will have to come through them first." The handgunners shifted uneasily. The survivors of the Mire company stared at the soldiers behind the barricade with the flat, hungry patience of people who had spent the night killing things that did not die properly. No one at Fort Muckenhoff wanted to be the first man to test whether they had strength left. Kessel's mouth tightened. Venn stepped to the roadside ditch and tore a long strip from a dead man's cloak. It might once have been yellow. It might once have been white. No one could tell. He dipped it into the mud, twisted it until it was dark and dripping, then tied it to a broken spear, a banner of filth. He handed it to Marta. "What is that meant to be?" Holtz asked. Venn looked down the road leading away from the fort, away from the swamp, away from every court that had condemned them and every officer who had spent them like rotten coin. "Proof," he said. "Of what?" "That mud takes all, but not today." They walked away from Fort Muckenhoff while the soldiers watched in silence. No one cheered. No priest blessed them. No record would name them heroes. Behind them, deep in the Graven Mire, something whispered once from beneath the mud. A name, perhaps, or many names. But the whisper broke apart before it could become a command. The surviving convicts, drunkards, deserters, smugglers, and murderers marched down the road beneath their dripping banner. At their head limped Oskar Venn. By nightfall, the border villagers would begin calling him the Mud General. By winter, officers would deny he had ever existed. But in taverns near the mire, when rain hammered the roof and the roads turned black, old soldiers would lower their voices and say there had once been a company so foul, so frightened, so damned and stubborn that even the dead could not bear to remember them.